Hereby, I open the academic ceremony in which Inge Römgens will defend her academic thesis titled The Troubled Suitcase, Taking Seriously Collaborative Artistic Research Practices. Dear candidate, may I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you, Pro-Rector, Professor Thijsman. Ladies and gentlemen here today, welcome. And thank you all for your interest in my research on practices of artistic research. My dissertation, The Troubled Suitcase, Taking Seriously Collaborative Practices of Artistic Research, revolves around the research question, what trouble do attempts to take the arts no less seriously than the sciences as epistemic practices of artistic research bring forward, and how can I, as a researcher interested in artistic research, stay with this trouble? This is a mouthful and two separate questions, in fact. The first part of my research question presupposes that practices of artistic research are trouble, and in the way it is formulated also kind of gives away how they are trouble, with the reference to attempts to take the arts no less seriously than the sciences as epistemic practices. By the way, epistemic practice means ways of getting to know the world. This formulation suggests that art practices involve different ways of getting to know the world than academic practices, and that all those different practices are not taken equally seriously. This became clear from the literature that I studied on practices of artistic research, and also from my fieldwork in two case studies, where I tried to collaborate with theater artists. Kiki van Aubel and her colleagues at het Laagland in a project called Buren en Bagage, and Michael Gijzen, together with Nina Willems, in the second project called Research Studio. So my thesis is based on analysis of the literature and ethnographic fieldwork, which I characterize as observant participation in two case studies. In response to the first part of the question, I identify 4 kinds of trouble that I each describe in a separate chapter in the second act of my dissertation, and which I have listed on this slide. Please take a moment to have a look at the slide. So all these forms of trouble revolve around issues of familiarity or a lack thereof with different kinds of practices, with the expectations and assumptions about those practices and corresponding languages for understanding and discussing those practices and ways of valuing or assessing the practices. Based on my analysis of the literature and my observations in the field, I claim that to understand and relate to practices of artistic research with an aim of taking the arts no less seriously than the sciences and vice versa, it is necessary to stay close to the trouble involved with these practices. And that's where the second part of my research question comes in. As a means of staying close to the 4 types of trouble I identified, I experiment with ways of what in the literature has been called building dialogue empathically as technique of reflection. In the course of my project, I have started to use my experiences from the fieldwork and the literature to create space and forms of reflection and dialogue across differences, without trying to erase these differences.
Excuse me, I think you need me to be reminded and explain to the people here today what this project tries to do, staying with the trouble of collaborative artistic research practices. No, this kind of presentation is not it. It doesn't fit to what your project is all about. Relating to practices of artistic research is about building dialogue across differences with the artists. I'm glad you didn't put me on a post-it though.
Jongens, RQ heeft gelijk. Maar hoe ga ik ooit dit hele project samenvatten in 15 minuten?
10 inmiddels.
Niet.
Wat was dat?
Dat was RQ, de onderzoeksvraag. Hij is een personage in mijn proefschrift en hij laat hier nu ook zijn stem horen.
Wat bedoel je eigenlijk met niet?
Inge heeft 7 jaar onderzoek gedaan. Misschien moet ze niet proberen om dat samen te vatten.
Nee, dat is waar. Misschien moet je het persoonlijk maken. Wat heeft het meeste met jou gedaan, persoonlijk?
Ja, wat waren jouw aha-erlebnissen?
Ja, maar dat is het dus al, hè? Dat jullie me dat vragen in een setting als deze. Wat het meeste met mij persoonlijk heeft gedaan. Daar snapte ik echt helemaal niks van. Dat starten vanuit mezelf en dan begrijpen dat niemand zit te wachten op mijn emotional vomit. Daar, heb ik het maar gezegd. Al zouden we die term niet meer gebruiken, weet je nog, Michael?
Ja, wat die term is van mij. Ik heb daar de playwrights voor, dus ik zou zeggen gebruiken. Emotional vomit en het helikopterke waarmee je dat overstijgt. Dat was toch onze definitie van artistic research, dacht ik. Ik vind hem nog altijd heel goed. Het onderzoek begint vanuit een persoonlijke fascinatie. Dat is superbelangrijk in ons vak, vind ik. En dat ga je dan contextualiseren met academische literatuur bijvoorbeeld.
Ja, of met bestaande kunst.
Ja, dat is artistiek onderzoek, toch?
Maar die RQ, die onderzoeksvraag, een personage?
Ja, ik was met theater bezig, dus daar heb ik er een personage van gemaakt.
Maar wij waren helemaal niet met theater bezig. Ja, niet op de manier waarop je zou denken, in ieder geval.
Onderzoeksvraag als personage, ik vind dat een leuke vondst. Ik heb daar nog nooit van gehoord.
Ja, maar het kwam in ons onderzoek, in ons project, niet voor.
Nee, dat klopt. In de projecten zelf kwam dat inderdaad niet voor. Dat is ontstaan tijdens het schrijfproces. Doordat ik nadacht over hoe in theater alles een stem kan hebben. En die van RQ begon ik me voor te stellen als ik weer eens vasthing en niet wist hoe ik verder moest. Eerst niet eens zo heel bewust. Het was iets intuïtiefs. En daar ben ik op gaan reflecteren. Eigenlijk met name omdat het me opviel hoeveel moeite studenten hebben met de rol van een onderzoeksvraag in het onderwijs.
Dat klopt, daar hebben ze heel veel moeite mee, ja.
Dus daarom ging ik mij in mijn schrijfproces afvragen hoe ik mijn onderzoeksvraag voor mij kon laten werken. In mijn geval in het proces van analyse en schrijven.
En dat heb je dus heel letterlijk genomen. Als een letterlijke stem in het proces.
Ja, en het hielp. Het hielp om de meerstemmigheid in artistiek onderzoek waar ik over probeerde te schrijven, om dat vorm te geven. En het hielp eigenlijk vooral ook heel erg als ik weer eens vasthing. Als ik niet wist hoe ik verder moest, ja, dan had RQ wel een idee. Omdat het een manier was om op een hele primaire en ongepolijste manier op te schrijven wat ik dacht. Een andere manier van denken, zeg maar.
Nee, wacht even. Dus zoals die oefening met het Kerkraads dialect die jij in je boek beschrijft.
Ja, precies. Het werd een oefening in denken en schrijven ingegeven door het samenwerken met jullie en mijn interpretatie daarvan. Zonder dat dat ook noodzakelijk iets was wat jullie ook zo deden, precies.
Even een andere vraag. Kan iemand mij even uitleggen waarom iedereen een chocolade-paaseitje heeft gekregen in oktober? Wat heeft dat met artistiek onderzoek te maken?
Ja, dat is natuurlijk in eerste instantie een persoonlijke verwijzing naar Kiki, want die werkt niet zonder snoep.
Ja, dat is waar. Heel veel thee en snoep. Inburen en bagage alleen al.
En dat trok mijn aandacht. Dus zo is het hoofdstuk Chocolate Easter Eggs as a Research Catalyst ontstaan. Daarin gebruik ik dat snoep als evocatief object. Dat is een methode die onder andere in cultural studies wordt gebruikt en ook in science and technology studies om gedachten en associaties rondom iets los te peuteren. In die zin is het snoep vergelijkbaar met de koffer uit de titel van het proefschrift. Die koffer gebruikt namelijk ook als evocatief object. En dat snoep vond ik met name zo interessant omdat het me aanvankelijk op het spoor zette van het identificeren van wat er zo artistiek was of theatraal aan jullie manier van onderzoek doen. Zodoende was mijn eerste gedachte om te willen begrijpen wat dat was, dat artistieke, dat theatrale. En associeerde ik die elementen met aspecten van onderzoek waar kunstenaars vooral heel goed in zijn. Volgens de literatuur, zoals affect, het creëren van ervaringen, de aandacht voor sfeer. Maar tegelijkertijd bracht me dat ook in een enorme valkuil. De two cultures valkuil.
Ja, dus dat idee dat kunst en wetenschap van oudsher worden gezien als verschillende manieren om naar de wereld te kijken. En dat die verschillen in artistiek onderzoek ofwel clashen, overbrugd moeten worden, of spannende vernieuwing opleveren.
Maar in de literatuur wordt die two cultures tegenstelling vakkundig onderuit geschopt, toch? Kunst en wetenschap zijn in veel opzichten helemaal niet zo verschillend als vaak wordt gedacht. En het denken in tegenstellingen doet meestal geen recht aan een praktijk die eigenlijk altijd veel genuanceerder is.
Ja, precies. En het wijst op stereotypen die in de praktijk eerder hinderlijk zijn dan helpend. Om te komen tot productieve samenwerking. En dat was bij ons ook het geval.
Ja, we hadden allemaal de nodige aannames, stereotypen ook, over elkaar en elkaars praktijken, zonder eigenlijk echt goed te weten hoe we die praktijken konden leren kennen, of zonder ze echt te kennen. En ondanks dat we heel veel met elkaar praten, konden we daar niet met elkaar over praten.
Maar we hadden eigenlijk ook geen woorden om goed aan elkaar te kunnen uitleggen wat voor ons artistiek onderzoek nu eigenlijk was. Of hoe we verschillend of helemaal niet zo verschillend te werk gingen.
Ja, dus zo kwam jij op die emotional vomit.
Ja, dat was mijn manier om het proces in kaart te brengen. Ja. En zeg Inge, dus daarom noem jij die eitjes een research catalyst? Want dat zijn uiteindelijk ook de onderwerpen waar jij in jouw onderzoek op verder gaat, toch?
Ja, precies.
Op hoe jij verschillende praktijken kunt leren kennen en hoe je komt tot een taal met elkaar, of ook niet.
Ja, precies. Zo precies.
En voor ons speelde dat snoep en die thee een hele belangrijke rol in het verzamelen van persoonlijke verhalen. Dat draagt bij aan het creëren van een sfeer die voor ons belangrijk was om een ontmoeting aan te kunnen gaan.
Zoals die koffer.
Ja, precies. En wat mij zo fascineerde, dat we dus helemaal niet wisten met elkaar hoe we dit alles aan elkaar moesten duidelijk maken, uitleggen, maar ook uit konden leggen waarom dat zo belangrijk was, waarom dat deel was van jullie onderzoeksmethode en wat ik daarmee kon als niet-theatermaker.
Wat heb jij eigenlijk gedaan met die koffer?
Geschreven.
Geschreven?
Ja.
Even nog een andere vraag als het mag. De mensen hier praten Engels, toch? Of vele mensen hier praten Engels, toch? Moet deze presentatie niet in het Engels zijn dan, Inge?
Ja, dat klopt.
Okay.
Maar ik heb altijd Nederlands met jullie gesproken. En in mijn proefschrift leg ik ook uit waarom het volgens mij belangrijk is dat iedereen zijn eigen stem, dus zijn eigen taal spreekt. Dus ik denk dat we dat nu ook maar het beste doen.
Ja, maar dan begrijpt dus niet iedereen wat we zeggen.
Nee, dat klopt. Verschillende mensen zullen verschillende dingen begrijpen of niet begrijpen. Maar dat is volgens mij ook aan de hand in artistiek onderzoek.
Thank curiosity. They are finding each other, trying to figure out their odd togetherness and how to work through their odd kinship.
All right. Tot hier. Het woord gaat terug naar u.
Thank you very much in English for your exciting presentation. Before we proceed with the opposition, let me briefly introduce the committee to the audience. So on my opposite side left, we have Professor Dekker. And then next to him we have Dr. Rausch and Dr. Benschop. And they are the thesis supervisors. And they should have actually been accompanied by Dr. Vage, but she, in the last minute, couldn't be here. Then we're continuing with Dr. Witske and Dr. Vermeer. And on this side we have Professor Wyatt, Professor Steinbock, and Professor Peters, who is the acting secretary of the degree committee. And my name is Thuisman, and I'm representing our rector for this meeting. And the opposition will now be opened by Professor Wyatt. She is a professor of digital cultures at Maastricht University, and she is also the chair of the assessment committee. Professor Wyatt, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Pro-Rector. Dear candidate, dear Inge, congratulations on finishing this beautiful book with its wonderful form, different colors, different fonts, different styles, different persona. And I'm going to ask about the persona. It's very impressive to produce this, given you're also teaching at UCM and working on this during the pandemic. So my first set of questions, and just so you can pace yourself, I have 3 sets of questions. My first set of questions is about the lead characters. And I'd like to start by asking if the suitcase is here. I don't see it.
No, it's not here.
Oh, that's very sad. And I was also wondering if you had any plans for handing it on, and if so, to whom. And on page 291, you do say it's ready for a new journey, so I'd like to know more about its future plans. Related to this is still the first set of questions. On pages 19 to 21, the readers are introduced to various humans and non-humans, including the suitcase, and there are only 5, though actually many more, as the literature references constitute a multitude. But I think, anyway, there are more than 5, not only the authors mentioned in your bibliography. And maybe not the extras or the figurants, which might include your students and some of those people here today, but you quite often address the reader directly in your text, sort of involving us in the process, which is very welcoming. But I was curious if you had an imagined reader when you were writing, and who that was. Was it your illustrious supervisor, to whom we've just been introduced, also a small multitude? Was it the assessment committee, most of whom are here today? Was it the full set of opponents here for the occasion, some of whom are in full costume? But the supervisors you've known from the beginning, but the assessment committee and the opponents remained unknown and unknowable until quite late in the process. And no pressure, but we are quite important to the decision-making process about whether or not to award you a PhD. Would knowing who we were have made a difference? Were we part of your imagined readership? So this is the first set of questions, or 2 of them really. What's happening with the suitcase, and who was your imagined reader?
Okay. Highly esteemed opponent. Dear Professor Wyatt, thank you very much for your kind words and your thought-provoking questions. I'm going to start with the future of the suitcase. I deliberately did not bring it here today, even though in the book I think I explained that it is a real suitcase that I received as a gift from Rut, who actually participated in Buren en Bagage, who herself had received it as a gift from Inge Thérèse as part of Buren en Bagage. And it served as an evocative project through exercises part of that particular project. Now, I also used it as such, but in the course of the process of my writing, I learned that the suitcase, the physical suitcase itself, disappeared more and more. So the gathering dust in the corner that I write about was actually happening for the physical object that the suitcase was. And I think it's still the case, but I have a plan for it. But I also noticed that the physical suitcase disappeared because the function that it fulfilled as an evocative object kind of took over. So the idea of the suitcase took over from the suitcase itself in the course of the writing. So the concept and the associations were sort of exceeding this particular suitcase here and there. So it started my thinking and it got it rolling. And then I did a couple of exercises and experiments with it myself, with the particular suitcase, bringing it to meetings at UCM, trying to use it there as an evocative object, also at the lectorat at the Art Academy, actually. But I didn't really find what to do with it in those settings. So I left it in my office, continued writing, but my imagination about that suitcase opened up and expanded and sort of ran with me, kind of. So that's the role that it fulfilled. In the conclusion, I then write, of course, about the suitcase literally taking off and going to another place. I have a particular description of a quite specific place where I then put it, and I imagine to actually put it there. I was just thinking about that before I came here. That's funny. That I was planning on putting it actually in the art science lab at UCM, which we newly opened. We just got the furniture a couple of, I think, months by now ago. It was a place in development. It was always not finished. First, there was no furniture yet. Now there is furniture, but we haven't actually gotten to to own the place and to kind of make an organization for it and how it will be looked after and maintained. So I decided, I think the concept that I described about putting the suitcase there as a sort of remnant for trouble, I still really would like to do that, but I wanted first to make sure that it wouldn't get like perceived as trash that, you know, is sort of cluttering the space. And it needs a concept. It needs a concept when I put it there. And I'm still sort of trying to figure that out. Characters. Yes, I introduce different characters and I distinguish between the characters that I use to drive the story, which is the I, which is autobiographically inspired, the RQ, which is a different voice of the author, basically, and also the suitcase and the references and the director, which is also yet again another version of the author. And then I address the reader. Had I pictured you as an assessor? No, of course not. But I had been picturing a reader that I imagined would be someone interested in artistic research. And I sort of continuously try to write for both colleagues within the realm of the university, researchers, professors, educators, with an interest in research practices, but also artists. I was also thinking about the colleagues that I did the projects with, Micha Kiki and the rest of the team at het Laagland and the other theater artists. So I try to keep both in mind and write for, both, and a sort of anonymous, expansion of that.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to move on to another question, sort of briefly, and I guess it's about the I, in a sense, and how you describe yourself and your own role.
Yeah.
And you use different terms, including ethnographer, outsider, stranger, sometimes other, participant, observer, and you emphasize the skills of noticing, of attention, of reflection, of moving between, and what you also sometimes call disciplined subjectivity. And in particularly in chapter 3, you discuss this and refer to the work of Vinciane Desprez over visitors. Now, this is going to sound really pretentious, for my apologies, and I'm not really that familiar with it, but when I was reading this again earlier this week, I was reminded of Derrida's work on hospitality and the guest, and I was curious whether or not you thought about using guest as a metaphor instead of the other ones I just mentioned. And, you know, are the power relations different between a visitor and the visited, between guest and host? Are the expectations of behavior, of gift giving, of the length of the stay, could they also be different? And we don't have much time, so if you could perhaps briefly reflect on that.
Okay, thank you very much. That is a challenging question. I appreciate it. And one which actually needs further consideration on my part. No, I had not consulted the particular reading by Derrida that you are referring to. I came to the concept of Desprez because Haraway uses it. And so through Haraway, and that was a connection to the visitor, and I had not given the concept further consideration. So I had not compared the different approaches or considered their conceptual implications. This would be definitely something for further consideration.
Thank you very much. Then the opposition will be continued by Professor Steinbock, who is Professor of Transgender Studies, Arts and Cultural Activism at this university, and also a member of the assessment committee.
Dear candidate, first my compliments on your decidedly stylized writing, which incorporates different personas and voices that make a theater of academic and artistic modes of working, and I'm enjoying participating in that theater today. I found it to be a highly creative means to effectively animate the two cultures and to pluralize them within the space of your dissertation. The dissertation, as I understand it, departs from the widely cited 1950s C.P. Snow reference to the two cultures of science and literature, and wonders if this is now an irrelevant piece of a polemic, especially with the rise in artistic research. The investigation into what you call the spaces of productive unhomeliness takes a decidedly empirical approach to ask in the field of making what does collaboration between arts and sciences actually entail? Where are the spaces of productive unhomeliness, and what happens there? I have a two-part question for you that asks for you to expand on what I see as 2 points of tension that occur within your research into these spaces of productive unhomeliness. And we are encouraged to have a kind of back and forth with you, so I'm just going to give you the first part. The first point of tension has to do with the highly collaborative way that you entered your fieldwork, which we also got to get a taste of today. Your persona was primarily as a researcher, what you call an observant, form of observant participation, whereas you collaborated, when you collaborated with performers and theater makers. Now, implied within the two cultures is a hierarchy, signaled by payment, but also a weighting of logic, seriousness, and rigor. Collaboration is a notion widely used in management speak that has been championed in music and fashion, what we hear today as collabs very often. And we cite collaboration also at this university as an ideal modus of the educator and researcher who brings combinations of scientific and societal partners together. Collaboration seems like a win-win for everyone in that it pools resources and talent in a joint effort. It entails a high degree of coordination amongst multiple parties who are working together aimed at a shared goal. Now, as in the business world between artist and scientist and melded in artistic research, collaborations rarely take place amongst equally weighted parties or interlocutors. Perhaps the use of the widespread uptake of this term is due to how it hides or smooths over this fact of implied or even explicit hierarchies. I wish to invite you to reflect on your experience of collaboration touted as an ideal and the actuality of who brings which credentials and expertise, who provides what labor along with the implied value placed on such labor, that knowledge, skill, cognition, and competences. Do you think that the implied and sometimes explicit hierarchies established between scientific disciplines and artistic practices is a core form of the trouble presented by artistic research? How can collaborations be a good form of trouble in drawing these hierarchies to our attention, even upending them?
Highly esteemed opponent, dear Eliza, thank you very much for your kind words and for the question. I was just writing it, and I just want to make sure that I understood you correctly. So you're asking about whether my approach to collaboration, whether collaboration in general tends to hide hierarchies, and what my experiences are with this, whether I experienced these hierarchies or whether they were also at play in my projects. The first thing that comes to mind in response to this question is the chapter on collaboration as sharing practices, where I try to make explicit the assumptions and expectations about the different kinds of roles and presences that are taking part in that case, the project Buren en Bagage uit het Laagland. I think that definitely was it was a point of struggle. It was definitely a form of trouble that there were, well, I'm not sure, that is also the thing. So on the ground, it wasn't so clear. Well, there were clear there was a clear hierarchy because there are project leaders, initiators, people who brought in the funding, people who needed to give accountants of the project to other parties who were involved with setting it up. So in that sense, I guess there's always a hierarchy involved and always present. But the question is what it does. And I think we saw in Buren en Bagage that it did bring trouble in the sense that it did bring a lot of hesitancies and unclarity about everybody's roles, but not so much the actual hierarchy as the perceived ones. Because I think the two are sort of running they're going together and they're sort of running through one another in not always so clear ways. So there are the clear hierarchies in the sense of who is the project leader and who takes accountability, but also of, for example, the idea that the theater artists had about me coming in as an academic to check if what they was doing is good research. So this is, and that's the kind of, and me not being sort of aware immediately of this. But that is sort of, because I was not even seeing myself as a trained academic at that point in time. I saw myself as a beginner as well. So this needed space and deliberate attention before we could even get to the content of the project. And I think this, that's what I try to disentangle in the sharing practices chapter, which was based on this theoretical notion of collaboration as sharing practices by Rabineau and Bennett. But I noticed that before we could even get there, we could even get to the content, we first had to work our way through this sort of conundrum of expectations and assumptions and perceptions. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I'm appreciating that you took a step back in a way from the first stage of research, which is also to kind of address what's in the room and what we all kind of bring with us. I would like to go on to ask another, let's say, aspect of the methodology that you rely on, which is your turn to the empirical. Which is also what you are looking for when you go into these rooms and you enter these collaborations. You're looking for things to observe and to experience. And for you, it seems like this is really proper evidence that you can rely on that comes back in the dissertation. So evidence that could be verified by observation or experience. And in this sense, you adhere to a particular evidential paradigm, to borrow a phrase from the Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg. But we might also have a conversation here about the empiricism of the Enlightenment, which is the founding order of experimental and natural sciences. So I'm curious about your, let's say, alignment with this version of science that seems to be a bit at odds with the overall project, this would be your scientific method. But do you consider empirical research and empiricism to be an oddkin or antithetical to the arts and humanities? This is a genuine question of mine. So it's not rhetorical, it's not leading. I really want to know about the placement of empiricism as a kind of guiding light for you. And I wonder if there's a guiding vision of empiricism at the heart of your doctoral research that unites or is in some happy way able to pluralize these various research cultures. Are you rethinking empiricism for us in the humanities?
Thank you very much for that question. Am I rethinking empiricism in the humanities? Well, what comes to mind right away is the literature on practices of autistic research that refers to, a lot of existing practices where artists use empirical methods and adopt and run with empirical methods in this sort of own way. And that there's this, I don't know, can I call it a field? I'm not sure, of research, a body of research that is already sort of mixing and mingling what could be classified as academic empirical research and art practices. The whole idea of, what was that book called again? Never mind, I probably remember later. So this already exists, and I think my project fits there, like with the whole sort of gray zone of existing practices where art, and that I don't know. That's also, I think, it's a space of productive and homeliness, I think, because if I would classify my work according to conventional paradigms of empiricism in opposition to the arts, would I not be falling back into the trap of the two cultures again? So I don't think that would be fitting. I think that's exactly what I sort of try to show, how art practice, so the integration of art practice and academic practices leads to practices that are maybe not something that radically never existed, but that shows characteristics of each without exactly being that which it is. And I think the ontmoeting is a nice example of it. It's a form of empirical research, I think, but it's also theatre, even though it's absolutely not anything like a theatre play. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be in dialogue.
Thank you.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Witsche, who is a lecturer of creative media for social change at Amsterdam University of Applied Sciences, and she's also a member of the assessment committee.
Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Inge, what a pleasure it has been to read this and to be part of this, indeed, performative act. I want to thank you, because in your acknowledgement, you write a thank you to your supervisors for not pressuring you into taking any specific approach, and that you didn't have to do things just simply because that's how they need to be done. I want to thank you for actually taking up that invitation, because many more than actually take on that invitation get the invitation, and some that take on the invitations do not pull it off, and you actually pull it off, so thank you. I have a first question, which is, I think, in line with my colleague who was just asking you about trouble. In your introduction, you write, so my question is also around trouble, and the role of trouble and your definition, perhaps, or your perception of what trouble is and what trouble does. So you write in your introduction, hybridity is trouble. Then you go on to state that it's because it's actually the trouble that comes when you take both perspectives equally, right? Or the both forms of knowledge. And it's there that I'd like you to reflect on. Is it the hybridity that is the trouble? Or actually the fact that you're taking something equally serious, one thing that hasn't, and then you come back to hierarchies, that hasn't been taken equally serious. You take it now equally serious. And so I wonder whether you can say a bit more about whose trouble is this? Would everyone consider this as trouble? And if you would have taken another approach, you also quote Tim Ingold, who actually asks us to correspond with our objects of study, and then states what happens if we, and I'm paraphrasing, but if we take on, actually we join the dreams and the hopes of those that we study, what would happen? And whose side would you take then? Would you take the artist dreams and hopes? And actually, if you would take on that perspective, would you have found something different? So it's basically around the notion of trouble, whose perspective on trouble, and what would have happened if you would have focused on hopes and dreams rather than staying with the trouble.
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind words and for your nice question. Notion of trouble, yes, whose trouble am I talking about? So my claim about hybridity being trouble, I think refers to the idea that when you put practices that are sometimes also really different or perceived as different, you mix and mingle them and you get something that is not immediately recognizable as something. So it shows family resemblance to existing practices, but it also seems to be kind of off, which is why I introduced this notion of oddkin, right? Nina called it shapes of just not, which I took from her. And because I really like that sort of the way that she formulated it really helped me to consider it in relation to conventions and institutions and established contexts and realities in which practices and also the results of those practices need to exist and happen. So the trouble in that sense lies in how this sort of coming together of practices that are maybe really different, but also maybe just perceived as different, how they come together and what they bring forward, and that they show in any kind of situation what is taken for granted within a particular context or within a particular kind of institution. And I myself try to avoid taking sides. So I try to avoid saying, well, what is trouble for the artist is not trouble for me, or what is trouble for me is not for the... Because that's not always true on the ground, right? You have sometimes shared troubles or shared things that you feel that you need to figure out, and how are we going to apply for this and that funding scheme, where who takes the lead, who takes on that, again, roles, but also to understand practices. I don't think it's a one side or the other kind of matter. It can also be shared, or it can be a sort of external thing that you sort of need to relate to together. But what I try to argue, and that's also why I then argue for this need for this time and this space for reflection, is that it always shows, the nature of conventions and how conventions organize practices, and you need to do things differently. If I want to play an audio file in this kind of setting, I'm causing a lot of trouble for the technicians, for example. They had to work very hard before this presentation because it's not conventionally done. This is not what people do, apparently, so it's not organized. But that's just a very practical example, of course. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. I have a second question. Because reading your thesis and also your focus on dialogue at the end, the word that came up for me was reconciliation, as if you were reconciling these two different strands of knowing or knowledge. And in Buddhism, you have a distinction between far and near enemies. And a far enemy is like you have a quality, and a far enemy is very clearly the opposite. But a near enemy seems close, but it's actually hindering the quality that you want. And when I was reading it, I was thinking, is reconciliation actually not doing harm to wanting to stay with the trouble? So to what extent is it? What is actually needed? What would trouble as an actor need? And is that something you've given enough in the thesis, with also a focus on reconciliation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. I don't consciously try to reconcile, I think, in the sense that I don't try to, because reconciliation would, for me, I would understand as trying to solve the trouble, as try to create a framework of peace, a kind of peaceful situation. I was recently reading this article, that talks about how trying to create a sort of harmonious environment would imply moving the trouble under the carpet, right? Or it would hide it. It would need to solve it. The artist that writes an academic article, after all, just to get that publication in that academic source, to get the recognition academically. Now, what I'm sort of more trying to raise attention for, perhaps, is how we can open up spaces. And maybe that links more to your hopes and dreams comment that you made before, that I try to kind of, and it feels a bit silly sometimes, but it feels like very hopeful as well to, I try to do that with the book, of course, right? Because in many ways, the book is not a monograph like other monographs that at least I have read. And I very deliberately try to have it not like that, because I try to write this book like the project was for me, to convey an experience of this entering the field of autistic research and being literally sort of torn into the different sides, thinking that you understand, and the moment you think you understand, you don't understand anything at all. And sort of how this process has sort of shaped the way that I have developed. I didn't have the concept of trouble at the beginning of research. It emerged exactly because I sort of refused, Teun is a witness to that, very actively so, to go for this reconciliation, right? And to find this frame where I could be productive and home in a sort of known environment. I tried to always like jump out of it again, which I felt like UCM gave a good context for because it was a liberal arts college. I also wanted to say that, by the way, that context, institutional context and backing of sorts is very crucial for this. And so in that sense, it played a very important role that I did this project at a liberal arts college. It also made me rethink again, what is this idea of liberal arts? What is the point of liberal arts? What is the point of being a liberal arts graduate? Not in any particular field. That's also why I position myself like that. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by my neighbor, Professor Peters, who is a professor of innovation of classical music at this university.
Dear candidate, dear Inge, I also want to congratulate you with your book, wonderful book. And I think it's an important contribution to the field of artistic research, whereas the debate on artistic research usually centers around individual artists and their practices. You approached it as boundary work between different epistemic cultures. And when boundary work is all about building dialogues, as you write in your book, you argue that this work should be seen as a technique of reflection. And I admire the way in which you build this need for reflection into your own writing. So for me, reading your book was an adventure, precisely because it challenged my own expectations as an academic researcher and invited me to question my habits and the routines I developed. To find a yellow post-it with the handwritten research question on page 129 of the book was a surprise. And to meet RQ as a character in the book that intervened in unexpected ways and that I even started to like, it was even more surprising. So as an artist's book, I think the content of your thesis is closely mirrored in its material qualities and typography. So my question relates to the importance of aligning content and form and what we can learn from your project for publishing academic research in the social sciences and/or humanities. To do justice to your own experience as a researcher, you chose to write your thesis as a mixed, which is a term you borrowed from Jean Ricardou and Jan Batens. Here the text becomes, and I quote page 116, a combination of different kinds of written forms as critical montage. End of quote. It is the heterogeneity of the textual assemblage that does justice to the complexity of trans and interdisciplinary research. And I find that a really convincing argument. I would like you to invite to reflect on the relevance of your book in other collaborative trans and interdisciplinary research practices. In a publishing landscape that has become increasingly protocolized, standardized, and automated even, what can we learn from your book about the trouble that researchers should stay with when they follow your lead in creating heterogeneous textual assemblages? Or to put it more simply, how can RQ survive in the world of academic publishing?
Highly esteemed opponent, dear Peter, thank you very much for your kind words and your nice question. How can RQ survive in the world of academic publishing? That's a good question. That's a good question. I was on the account of the feedback that I received to the draft of the book. There was also some literature recommendations in the field of performance philosophy research. And I had a look at the recently published performance philosophy, Routledge Performance Philosophy Introduction. And they also addressed this. And they also called for basically more flexibility and more openness to account for different forms of writing within the realm of academic publishing opportunities. So I try to do that also with this book by writing it in this way. I mean, it was a big it was a risk, I suppose, to do this and to write this. We had a lot of conversations about this, a lot of critical conversations also, because, well, it had to be a PhD eventually, and I had to comply to certain rules and regulations about the published first chapter, which was sharing practice and collaboration, which I then published as well. RQ became not happy with it, but I mean, that was sort of complying with academic conventions. But then the two languages included in that chapter presented problems of their own for the sort of accessibility for an audience. So yeah, I create trouble in this sense, and I think I explicate certain conventions, even though I think looking at this performance philosophy example, I'm not alone in this. I mean, performance writing is already taking multiple forms and sort of poetic approach. I don't think my text is wildly unconventional in sort of academic terms. I think artists would still say that's a very academic text. I mean, it's not a theater play anyway, right? So it's unconventional, but also not that unconventional. But it tries to, create attention for different approaches to writing.
Yeah, clearly. And I have a second question which relates to the academic character of the book, and I will keep it really short to have time for the last opponent. And the question relates to your use of literature, or actually the body of literature that you use in your study. You mobilize, of course, texts from very different disciplines, Donna Haraway, Nelson Goodman, but mostly it is from the social sciences and humanities, more particularly the field of science and technology studies. And I can understand that for many reasons, but I was wondering why you did not, or as far as I could tell, have any references to what artists have written about their research. I mean, there can be many examples ranging from Picasso to Steve Reich. But the question would be, why did you exclude their writings from a project that aims to, and then I quote, takes the arts no less seriously than the sciences?
Yeah, no, I did. I think I did also include some sources that are written or co-written by artists. The literature is more academic that I cite. I agree, which had to do with the literature search that I started off with, I think, from the academic context that I came from. And it had to do also with because I had a lot of conversations with Rud about this, actually, who tried to encourage me to include more art practice literature in my studies. And I really struggled with that, because in that sense, there was also this sort of two cultures, maybe unconscious approach in my mind, that whenever I would visit het Laagland or whenever I would work with the theater artists, that changed with Michai, by the way, they never really quoted literature, or they had not a lot of, we didn't talk about literature, we talked about practice, so we did the practices, actually. So that was, and then came Michai, and he had a great interest in literature and also a lot of references, so I used some of those. But yeah, so this I think that's where it comes from.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Vermeer, who is an assistant professor on evolutionary psychology and theory of learning at this university.
Thank you. Dear candidate, also dear Inge, obviously. I loved reading it. I think it was a great example of how something which initially doesn't look academic per se can still be exceptionally clear. To me, I never lost track. It was crystal clear writing. I really enjoyed it also, research question as a character and other characters. But I also share a bit of your dizziness at the end, right? You refer to reading, so I was a bit dizzy. And in looking for an anchor, right? I want the dizziness to stop. And also looking at the types of troubles you describe, different practices, different ruling practices, absence of shared vocabulary, these kinds of things. I was wondering whether or not the trouble that you perceive is the result of an absence of a sense of what knowledge could be. Right, so there's standard definitions of knowledge, like, for example, knowledge can be justified through belief, right? And if knowledge is a justified true belief, then we are after those types of things that we can call justified true belief. And therefore, some things in a practice contribute to this and some things don't. right? And then it allows you to sort of organize the trouble, maybe a little bit. Right? Or you take another one, it's conjectural knowledge, it's Popper's definition. And then if that is what you are after, right, you're not after beliefs, you're not after justified beliefs, but you're after conjectures that are testable and can be falsified. Again, if you then anchor or have a concept of knowledge, it will help you organize things, it will help you separate things out, and maybe also be able to sort of clarify some of the troubles a little bit. So I was wondering why is that absent, right? And also wondering about your perspective on this.
Yeah. Esteemed opponent, dear Peter, thank you very much for your kind words, for your nice question. Yes, do we have a clear theory of knowledge for artistic research? I take that you're asking, or why do I think this might be absent, resulting in my dizziness?
Well, yeah, or a concept. What are we doing, right? As scientists, we're trying to learn about the world. Yeah. Ways to get to know the world. Well, what is this thing? Knowing, what is that, right?
Yeah,
and if
exactly.
we have some sense of what that is, then we can separate what's useful, what's not useful, what contributes, what doesn't contribute, and maybe we can organize, and maybe even rearrange a few things, right? Say things, well, initially things that we think are, standardly perceived as scientific activity actually are very similar to what arts people do.
Definitely.
For these reasons, and the other way around, right?
Yeah. No, definitely. And I think so the one reference to type of knowledge in relation to art practices is, of course, often the affective knowledge, the knowledge that lies in experiences, experiential knowledge. But again, I do not want to fall in the trap of opposing them, because I think theater and other art practices can also be very conceptual. So, but maybe I think I agree with you that there might lie also part of the trouble, that I did not, to the best of my knowledge in the literature that I consulted so far, come across a clear definition of a theory of knowledge for artistic research practices, because it takes from the different conceptualizations that you just mentioned, alluding on the one hand to the falsification, not really falsification. I didn't really come across that in artistic research practices. It's mostly about our experiential knowledge, but then how this is defined and how this exactly and how that works, that is exactly what the research on practice of artistic research is all about, and how can we capture that verbally. I think that also the issue with verbalization, and how can we, I think you once said, how can we know about things that don't exist in words? I mean, in part, that's of course what ethnographers try to do, what I also try to do in this book, but there also always remains this aspect that you feel like you can't really grasp. And that's perhaps causing sort of part of my dizziness, I don't know, I guess. Yeah, but also because it's not only about experience and all about experience. So because it can also be about, it is also about beliefs and propositions, for sure. Not so much falsifications in the sense of having hypotheses that can be rejected or not. I don't think so, no. Does that answer your question at all? I'm sort of thinking aloud here, I notice.
A little bit, in the sense that you don't have to prefer one definition of knowledge over another. It's just that it helps you organize and it helps you think, right? You can even do it conditionally and say, well, if it is justified true belief that we do, then it distributes this way. If it is conjectural knowledge that we use, then it distributes that way. But it would help me. And there's another way to think about it, for example, that you say, I think if you look at our activities as scientists wanting to learn about the world, there are conditions that have to be met in order for us to be able to do science, especially in social sciences and humanities. And they have
the
to
arts
do with,
too, I think.
Yeah. And they have to do with reflectivity. Delphi Oracle, know thyself. Do not step in that door until you know yourself, because otherwise you don't know what the answer is that you're going to get, right? So it could also be that the types of activities that artistic research leads to are the conditions that have to be met in order for us to be scientists, and in order for us to be able to collect knowledge that we could call scientific knowledge. So it's not the same thing. We should also not treat them as the same thing, but it is absolutely necessary. But then you have also two different conceptions of knowledge and what we are after.
I don't think there is a conclusive approach in practices of artistic research. I think that is missing, to the best of my knowledge. There is no single conception of knowledge, and there is no, because also, I mean, I only touch upon a tiny tip of the iceberg of what even practices of artistic research is, right? They're not always collaborative, definitely not always theater, but they're as diverse as art practices exist. So
but they can't be everything.
Well, in the arts, that would be, why not? The question would be, why not, right? Yeah.
Inge Römgens, the time appointed for defending your thesis has now passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request that you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
All right, please.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Southside, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you've won the battle once you've grown. Southside, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 7 miles in my rearview mirror. I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer. East side to the west side. No place like home. If it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. 'Cause 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 I'll go the extra mile
Inge Römgens, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Decker is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
All rise, please.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times? Be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible.
Yes, I promise.
Then, by the authority vested in us, by law, and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I confer upon you, Inge Thérèse Römgens, the degree of doctor, and grant you all the rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and all the members of the committee here present, and affixed with the official Great Seal of the university. Dear Inge, I've been asked on behalf of the supervisory team to say a few words. I think one of the great lessons of your thesis is that being a researcher is not all that different from being an artist, which includes the many struggles that you face. And one of the lessons that art teaches us is that when you are creating something, it is not you who are in control of the thing you are creating. The thing you are creating is in control of you. It exists, and it wants to come into the world. And it is your job, as an artist and as a researcher, to bring it out into the world the way it wants to be. Which means, of course, that you have to figure out what it wants to be. And if that isn't hard enough, then you also have to defend it against all the people who are pulling at it and don't quite want it to be what it wants to be, but what they want it to be. And as I reflect on your journey, the thing that stands out most to me, apart from the praise that has been justifiably heaped upon the actual work, is the courageousness with which you have done that throughout the process. Because if I look back at the first version of your proposal, it was very different from what we have here today. We went through many iterations. I think I count 5 different endings that we explored. Research question, I think we had 3 or 4 of those. And you had to constantly rearrange things, move things around, find out how things obeyed their own internal logic. You had to do an awful lot of killing your darlings, of taking out things that you wanted to be there, but that didn't want to be there. And you had to let the form do its own thing, liberated from the conventions of the academic world. And then, that is a really hard thing to do. It is frustrating because it's non-linear, and you have to constantly fight with the thing that you are trying to create. And not only that, but then you have to bring it out into the world against a whole range of obstacles. You had 4 supervisors, very different ones, a lecturer in what the arts know, a cultural ethnographer, an anthropologist, and worst of all, an analytical philosopher. May I just say that the first half of your opening presentation, thank you, but they were all pulling on you and all trying to make it something that they could relate to. And you, I think, magically, gracefully were able to take the ideas from those conversations that worked for you, but never surrendered to them. And then you had to deal with the bureaucracy that you mentioned, right? Even the technology of being able to do what you want to. The PhD regulations, you had to wiggle it through. And then, of course, there's life with the challenges it throws at you, also the many teaching that you had to do, and the wonderful distractions that life has to offer, including, I believe, the one over there. And yet you navigated all of that with elegance, never in a nasty way, but always sticking to the vision of what this had to be. And so, at the end of that, we have which looked like a small object, but something that exists in the way it wants to exist. As Sondheim might have put it, look, you made a hat where there never was a hat. So now that it is in the world and it is what it wants to be, it has to do what it wants to do. And I think that this project, this thesis, will do quite a lot. It has already done quite a lot. At UCM, it has been instrumental in our work in artistic research, in our research studio, which many students have participated in and which will continue to develop once the SUITCASE is properly installed in its rightful place. At Miriam, developing artistic research at UCM. But I hope that it will also contribute a lot to research generally and inspire researchers to embrace their inner artist, to let things be what they want to be, to not be stuck in conventions, and to fight in good ways, in elegant ways, but never with compromise, to let them be the way they want to be and do what they want to do in the world. As research and teaching becomes ever harder in society, that is a lesson that I am, and I think we all should be, very grateful for. So congratulations, Dr. Römgens, and we look forward to seeing how your career develops.
Dear Dr. Römgens, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you with the doctorate degree that you've just acquired. And I'd like to also extend my congratulations to your supervisors and to your family, your friends and colleagues who all attended this meeting. And I would like to thank all the members of the degree committee, and especially those coming far, for your participation at this session. It's much appreciated. We will now use the opportunity to take some pictures with the candidate and the full degree committee at the stairs in the hallway. I've understood that a reception is taking place at the Van Eyck Academy, so I'd like to ask all your friends and family to already move there, where you can congratulate the young doctor. So thank you all very much for attending this milestone event for Inge, and I now close this academic meeting.